And it's Friday and it's time for another one of our famous podcasts, Mr. Project Manager Tim.
How are you doing, Mr. Project Manager Merv? Are you?
I've done better. If my voice gives out a little bit today, it's because I'm struggling a little, but we'll get there. We'll get through this.
Good. Sure we will.
I happen to look over and you're talking about integrating project planning activities today. Integration of project planning activities, which I guess from my perspective is probably something that we as project managers need to deal with at all times. We certainly need to be aware of it. But can I interest you in a little upfront story in terms of how I feel, where I feel it starts?
Oh, please do. Please do.
I feel it starts in project planning. Integration of activities starts before the project begins. And I think this may be something that that can kind of elicit some of our comments today, and maybe we can wrap up with the same thing. But in my experience, I remember I was hired by a large organization at one point to help them do their procurement. And in order to do their procurement, they needed to be satisfied that they would end up with a solid return on investment. And in fact, the people financing, or the organization financing this organization's project, was absolutely intent on getting a return on investment calculation. So I went through probably, I'm guessing 5-6 months of work, of effort with their staff, their financial accounting staff. We did a cost benefit analysis. We did a feasibility study. We did alternatives analyses. And we came up with what we thought was a great request for proposal idea process, and developed a return on investment. But here's where I kind of want to leave a lingering thought, maybe that we can wrap up with. To my knowledge, after we finished the project, no one went back to the return on investment calculation to determine if we had actually met our financial feasibility goals. So it was kind of disappointing to me. But anyway, that's the kind of the whole idea of beginning with the very upfront aspects of the project. We need to start worrying about integrating project activities and get them started correctly.
Let me compare that to one of my experiences.
Absolutely.
I was pulled on to another project that I wasn't a manager of, and they asked me to be the financial analyst, to be the bean counter. And they needed to build a business case to justify spending money. This was a Fortune 5 corporation. They were consolidating 375 odd data centers into 164. And one of the 5 chief information officers was working with me on this. And he looked at my 72 tab Excel spreadsheet. You know what I'm talking about. And he said 126% return on investment. Wow, that's great, Tim. I like your numbers too. And he knew his finance team had validated the numbers with me. And he said, okay, show me the tests and inspections where you're going to test for that return on investment. Show me the results that actually measure that this will indeed deliver. And then let's talk about how you're going to hand that return on investment over to me at the end of the project. He was asking the same question you were.
Yeah.
Is this big picture objective really something that you just use to sell the project, or do you use it and hand it over along with the deliverable at the end?
And there's the gist. Did you use it to just sell the project? Or did you in fact go and compare? And I know you're big on value metrics, and we'll probably get into that later on, but woe to the person who sells the project to win it and then not deliver.
Yeah. I tell you, in no other industry would you be able to pull that off. You buy a car for its value, and you don't have the car, you return it. But what do you do with projects that don't have these comprehensive, these big systemic values that hand over?
Well, and as normal, as we normally do, let's begin this conversation. I'm already getting intrigued. Let's begin this conversation with a definition. What do we mean by integrating project phases, plans, all of that stuff? What do we
Let's
mean by it?
let's just define integration.
Yeah,
The end.
let's do that. Yeah.
That's the standard definition. This means, the approved definition inside and outside of project management is coordination, consolidation, unification. It's tying everything into one comprehensive whole. It's like when we're taking all these separate plans and making sure they fit together to make one plan that makes sense.
Well, and I like that because what we often forget, and a lot of younger project managers, when they get all excited about starting a new project, they believe that the project plan is the schedule and perhaps resourcing against that schedule. But they don't think of all the other aspects like the stakeholder engagement plan, the scope management plan, the requirements management plan, the schedule management plan, the communication management plan, the risk management plan, and on and on. And that really is the project management plan, all of those discrete entities. And it's really, really important that we don't just kind of focus on the schedule, for example, at the, while ignoring the other ones. We never want to do that.
Well, and let's actually look at the big problem, the overarching problem. You're right with schedule, but that's just one symptom of what we're really talking about here. Let's say that your project, you only have $65,000 to spend on this project. Okay. And then you have another requirement that says it needs to be done by January. Okay. And then when you integrate, you see we only have $65,000 and we have to be done. All of a sudden, you don't have just two problems. You have 3 or 5 problems that are gathering because all of a sudden you have these constraints, both in schedule and in budget. And that's where we get in trouble. It's not necessarily how the plans all fit together, like our resourcing and our schedule and our quality and risk. It's these limiting factors, these factors who can't change. And all of a sudden they start banging their heads against the project, but they also bang their heads against each other.
Well, and what you conveniently left out, I don't know if you meant to, but you left out the scope aspect of that. Yes, I have budget. Yes, I have time. But what is the amount of work I have to do between now and January for that $65,000?
And we started exploring this. If you go back in project management history, we started exploring this with a guy by the name of Brooks in the Mythical Man Month. And he talked about what we call the triple constraint or the iron triangle, where you cannot just consider the constraints against the project. You also have to consider the constraints impacting each other.
Oh, yeah. And obviously the triple constraint being that of scope, cost, and time.
You know what's funny about the theory of constraints? It starts off with the triple constraint, and you can see it with the additions of the PMBOK. And in the next PMBOK, I think it was 4, they said, you know what? We forgot to put quality. Quality is a constraint too. And so they decided to have a triangle with quality in the middle. And then somebody said, no, it's more like a pyramid. And then somebody said, no, it's more like a square or a cube or something. And then all of a sudden, somebody in their right mind said, the theory of constraints is all constraints, risk and quality and resourcing and scope and schedule and cost. And it's tying all these things together that we need to use in integration. So they stopped trying to play with constraints as a definition, and they looked at how we need to approach constraints in general in our project.
Well, and that makes a lot of sense. One of my favorite depictions of the triple constraint, going back to the scope, time, and cost, is think of a teeter-totter, a child's teeter-totter, and then you're trying to balance it exactly. So if you have your scope on one side and your time and your cost on the other side, and they balance nicely, putting the other constraints aside, that's not a bad project. That's kind of going back to the $65,000 by January. I can do that as long as the scope one, isn't too heavy for me to lift by January. But
And
yeah, once you start adding communication and risk and all those things, you really are juggling many, many balls.
and the fact is, a triangle really is a good analogy for constraints, because by defining two of those sides, the third side, the angles plus the length, are already defined for you. So you may be flexible in some areas, but the theory of constraints says being flexible in some areas demands that you be inflexible in others. And that's and you can only understand that once you play at that higher, more general, integrated level.
Well, and that's probably one of the hardest messages to take back to our customers as project managers, is saying, you know what, you're asking for 5 more things. I don't have time or budget for that. If you extend my schedule or give me more dollars, perhaps we can work something out. That is a hard message, but you're right. Something has to give, or we have to be inflexible and say, no, that's all the scope you get. If you want me to deliver on time.
Yeah. One of the things that I chuckle at a lot of times is we get into the topic of training, and we train ourselves and we train our teams. But the content that I use to train the project managers on says we also train our stakeholders. And one of the areas that we train our stakeholders in is the theory of constraints. Because if they understand the environment of a project, project is defined by its limitations, then within those limitations, we can actually use it. But you need to understand those rules, or you're not playing the same game.
Yeah, and that's when we talk about integrating our whole project planning effort. Part of that stakeholder engagement plan is one of the very first sub-plans in our project management plan that we have to get right. And we have to get buy-off from our stakeholders, from our customer. So what you said is exactly correct.
Yeah, and getting the scope right is important, but getting the scope right is the very first part. Once you get your scope, and I keep on saying this, and I try to drill it into my students' mindset too. Once you get your scope, everything else falls in place. But it's integration that helps us understand how they all work together.
Yeah. Well, and that's the other part, how they all work together. Because I know when I was a young project manager, I really liked managing the schedule and the budget. That was my favorite aspects. And what would happen? I would spend my time here and I would forget about stakeholder engagement. I would pay less attention to risk management. I wouldn't spend as much time as I needed to on the communication plan. And it hurt me and it hurt the project. So all of these pieces are so important in coming together.
So we're looking at two things, right? We're looking at the individual details of managing the different aspects of our work. And we're looking at the big picture and how it ties together. In your experience with big projects, how much time do you focus on the big picture compared to the focusing on the individual pieces?
So on big projects, typically we have to chunk them. If that, that's a very technical term that we use in project management. We have to chunk them. And so if I'm worrying about this 3-month chunk, I never let go of the full picture that takes me to the end goal. But where my client and I are most interested in is what's going on in this, say, this 3 or 4 or 5 month chunk of the project schedule and the project delivery. So I think we do both in our big projects. We always keep an eye on the end date, but in order to be able to keep an eye on that end date, sometimes we'll have project management plans of over 10,000 tasks. You can't keep track of that in your head. And so we have to sort of look at a period of time. And if we get that period of time correct, then hopefully we won't push out the end, or, at best we can maybe pull it in a little bit, but I think we do both. I think we manage to the big picture and also to the individual discrete pieces.
I do the same. And funny enough, I do the same whether it's a 6-week project or a 2-year project. I look at it as a bunch of systems, like a house or a car. A car is a good example, where you have a fuel system, an oil system. You have the drivetrain that turns the engine's energy into forward momentum and all those things. And so I see the individual components or the individual systems, but I see them as parts of a whole. And that's where I use my dashboard, basically the status and progress that's the result of the plan, that actually say, here's my warning lights across all these multiple systems.
Well, and I think it works well both in the agile process and in the waterfall process. Waterfall to me is, that's where I grew up. So it's a lot easier. If my requirements gathering portion of my project seems to be going on too long, then I know that if I'm meeting that scope, if I'm still within scope, I misestimated something, and therefore all of those extra requirements still in scope will end up in extra design effort, will end up in extra development effort. And as a result of that, my end date is now starting to get pushed. So already I'm looking ahead to see what I can do to bring all that in. I imagine in Agile, it's very similar, that you're always looking to the discrete piece, but you're always looking with an eye to the end result as well.
Exactly. A good example is a product owner bringing a product life cycle, basically a roadmap of a product to you, and say, hey, let's put this into a project, and we're going to have multiple releases. And that's the big picture. And what we want to do, and this is your product owner speaking, right? And product owner says, what we want to do is, we don't have the technology to build the phone we want, but we want to get this new phone out there so people can start talking about it. And so all of a sudden they're saying, here's the big picture. Here's the objective. Get out in front of the consumers quickly and develop an understanding of the needs and expectations as the technology becomes available. And then as the pieces of technology roll out, we can roll out different versions of the phone. And that's the big picture. That's the integration. And then you might have, inside these multiple releases, you might have multiple iterations. Now, what's funny is they don't call it integration in the 7th edition of PMBOK. They have a principle called systems thinking.
Yeah, we talked about that. I remember that one show, the whole idea of systems thinking. Well, and even what we're talking about today, there's, to me, there's always that cost thinking or value thinking the whole time through. If a project manager forgets to think cost-wise or value-wise to what you're leaving with your customer with, you're also going to start to lose effectiveness on what you're delivering to your customer.
Exactly. So we have so many dials, and what we're constantly doing is we're using an overarching mesh or an integration of all those dials that we're keeping an eye on in order to balance the project. And that's the thing. When you have constraints, you're never going to be able to resolve them. The best thing you can do is balance, and that's the key.
Well, and that's the hard part, I think, too, for up and coming project managers on their first efforts, is exactly that. How do I balance all of this? How do I get to the point where I am very confident the fact that I've tweaked this dial enough, but this one I'm going to back off a little? Where does that come from? I guess just from experience.
And that's what I wanted to ask you next. We can get really good, like you inferred earlier, we can get really good with our schedules and we can get really good at risk. But the problem is, at the cost of what? And second of all, how do we know to go back and forth between these individual components and the big picture. You just said, it's just something you learn. What do you think are the things that you learn, or the indicators that tell you you need to jump from one to the other?
So I think some of those indicators, they come from, and I'm so thankful I didn't have to do this. I got my MBA specifically, so I understood financials, but I never really got involved so much in developing the financials. We would use indicators such as earned value. We would take a look at, is it the SPI? Yeah, the SPI, which is the
Schedule
measure.
performance index, yeah.
Yeah, which is kind of a measure of your earned value over your projected earned value. And the closer you can come to one, the better you are at managing. So as long as my financial and my schedule people could help me with where I am along that line, I could figure out if I'm starting to get out of balance I could figure out where to start looking to see where I needed to tweak to bring things back in line. So yeah, you still have to have those indicators, but as a project manager, doesn't mean you have to be the one to develop those indicators, or at least not in my experience.
So yeah, there's a bunch of tools. And when you get into major projects, $100 million or more, usually this is offloaded. The earned value analysis is offloaded by a role in the federal government. They call them controllers. And as a controller, you may be doing the earned value analysis for 5 or 6 different projects at a time.
Yeah.
And we do schedule and cost for a reason, because they're easily quantifiable and they demonstrate whether we're getting work done or not, right? Whether we're spending money, whether we're moving the work forward. And then we can use other secondary indicators. One of them is the traceability matrix for the requirements, right? Are we meeting requirements? And if we're meeting requirements, what piece of the deliverable is being completed? So as you're checking off the requirements, you can say, hey, we have 35% of the deliverable complete, or 45 or 65. And then we have our issues and risks, right? And are they mostly red? Are they mostly green? We can actually be watching these as well. And there's a lot of other things we can measure. The question is, do you have so many dials you get lost in the numbers, or do you actually have a way to pull those dials into a picture that you can use very easily use?
Again, back to the large projects I've worked on. Yes, the people that were in the project management office would alert me with those kinds of numbers. But here's the other thing, and maybe this is the sixth sense that I was kind of alluding to. When we develop our project plan, we know our schedule because we put a lot of thought into it. We know kind of where all the major phases, the major areas are that we do some checks and balances. We also have resourced that schedule. We also resourced the project according to scope. So I know that my big numbers on any project are people costs. Everybody costs so much money in terms of their dollars, their earnings, their healthcare, their, all of those things that go into the people costs, their opportunity costs. And I can get a sixth sense. If I have to suddenly add people because I'm falling behind or have to do something, I suddenly am aware of the fact that this is going to cost me somewhere along the line. And I don't need my project management office to come and tell me, by the way, you're overrunning your project on the resource side. I already know that. Now, the challenge is, now what do I do about it?
That's the key. And that's where you have to be able to say, okay, we're ahead of schedule and under budget. Am I behind schedule and over budget? Am I effectively using my money to get work done? This is where it's not just enough to track and understand the numbers, but be able to interpret them into the appropriate actions we need to take. That's the art. There's always an art behind the science, and that's the art of this integrated approach to analysis.
If I had to add 5 people, is that because I misestimated, or do I have some underperformers? I should never be an issue of scope because I would never add people until I got confirmation of the scope increase from my customer. But if I feel like I have to keep on track by adding people, then something is amiss somewhere, and I have to go looking for that.
Yeah, one of the critical forms of analysis is root cause analysis. It's not just finding it, but finding the primary cause, because you could be chasing your tail, fixing, a symptom and not fixing the actual problem.
Right. Oh, huge. The yield sign has just gone up saying, slow down here. Think about this because it's an important factor.
Yeah, on my major projects, I actually had a collective view. I tried to delegate some of my scheduling and my cost to stakeholders like in finance and the team and experts on the schedule, because I wanted a different set of indicators. I need those big indicators like earned value and value streams and traceability, right? I need those up there to see how the project is moving forward as a whole. But then I learned two other sets of indicators. One, what's the health of the team? Because if the team is working together like they should be self-organizing. I can't keep my eye off them. And I don't want to look over their shoulders and tell them they're doing it wrong, but I need to keep an eye on them. So I need to figure out a couple metrics in making sure I have a healthy, thriving team. And then I need a lot of indicators, maybe 2 or 3, down at the individual level, the people that I work with directly, right? Are they engaged? Are they engaged? And are they contributing to the project on a regular basis? If those 3 sets, the individual, team, and project at a whole, actually allows me to quickly determine root cause and where the problems are.
Boy, and that's where communication comes in. We've talked about communication in all aspects of the project before, but communication, those 2 or 3 or 5 individuals that are direct reports to you, you are constantly communicating to them. You're constantly testing their hypotheses. You're constantly coaching and mentoring so that when they do provide you with some information, you can quickly make a judgment as to, are they just covering up for their own inadequacy, or are they telling me something that I need to know? Are they exaggerating? Are they, you have to kind of understand your team, and it has to come from communication.
Yeah, and it has to come from a state of curiosity. It can't be a state of condemnation or trying to prove them wrong so you can fix the problem. That's not healthy. It has to be something that actually not just improves the project, but improves the way you work together.
Well, in their education, because someday they want your job and you want to help them get your job.
That's right.
It just occurred to me, I want to go back to the whole integration piece. It occurred to me that we, as project management professionals leading projects, we typically do all of these discrete project planning pieces and get them involved. And yet we rely also heavily on our customer to do their part in collaborating with us to get their part of the project done. But how often do we as project managers insert ourselves into their business such that we help them with their own schedules and merge them with ours so that we are walking lockstep towards that end goal?
That's actually lumped into training your stakeholders. I really believe that. I think of myself when I am in a consulting project as basically a stranger in a unique culture. And I'm not there. I can't be the owner and I can't be the sponsor, but what I can be is the trusted advisor. One of my mentors called that. He was an agile mentor. He said, you're not there as giving advice. You're actually there consulting because advice is free.
Yeah.
And he said, but if they don't trust you, they're not going to help you. And the sign of great trust is when they bring you in to help them make business decision. And that's the goal of a professional relationship. Be there where you can share the rewards as well as, share the burdens together.
Yeah, I mean, you can't just sit there and say, we would have been on time with this release if you had enough of your subject matter experts on board at the right time. But now that you haven't, we're late and it's your fault. We have to be able to consolidate our schedules and work, as you were saying, in a collaborative fashion so that we become their trusted advisor.
Yeah. And the thing is, if we're really working on a problem that they're trying to solve, if this really is a problem, and that's the first thing we can help our customers with, understanding if this is the real problem they want to solve. Because I've had too many projects where they're working on something that's basically a band-aid or a symptom. And that's all right. But it's like having a doctor see somebody leave the office who's going to be limping for the next 8 months. I don't want that. I want to have somebody, number one, understand what the real problem is. And number two, I want to be working with them to help them solve the real problem, because it's a little bit more respect for me. I feel a little more pride because I'm really working on things that have great impact. Second of all, I'm going to make a little bit more money when I actually solve those problems.
I was just thinking as you were speaking, when you were a kid, did you get involved in what was called a three-legged race?
Oh, yeah.
Where they tied two of your legs together and then you kind of used that middle leg as your, and you race to the finish line?
Yep.
In many ways, what we're talking about, integrating our schedule with our client's schedule so that we have a single schedule, is that three-legged race. I mean, if you come unhitched, you can't cross that line ahead of them. It doesn't work.
That's right. That's exactly right. And that's the thing. Our success is their success.
Yeah.
And when they're paying us, it's more working on their success. And what we can add the value to is, here's my expert set of tools. Let me help you with your problem, but you have to understand how I'm going to use those tools. And let's have a conversation how both our toolkits work together.
Yeah. So let's extrapolate that a little bit as well. Have you ever been in a situation where, every component or many of the components are working beautifully, it seems like, but the entire project itself, when you really look up and take a look, is in danger of not meeting its objectives?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. It's like a doctor saying the surgery was successful, but the patient expired. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
We can get the individual pieces done. We can make that budget or make that schedule or keep that risk within a reasonable amount and still not make the objective, still not solve the problem.
I remember one project, we had the most incredibly beautiful training system. I mean, it was fantastic. The workbooks were great. The instructions were great. The overheads were great. Everything worked except the system we were training on. So what did it help to have this beautiful training system and we couldn't get the system to cooperate?
Right. That's the beautiful thing. I design a lot of classroom experiences, and that's one of the major risks I identify first. If I had to teach this face-to-face, if the computer system was not ready, would I still be able to teach that class successfully? And
Right.
we have to think about that as a project too. If, could I get this project done if I didn't have Microsoft Project or Primavera? Could I get this project done if all I had was Excel? Not only is this a good exercise for us in creative thinking, but it also is a very important risk. The technology we use, like Zoom and WebEx, may not work. What's our failover? How do we use that? And how do we use it effectively? It's not just the risk of the project deliverable that we're looking at. It's the risk of managing the project as well that we need to capture.
Yeah, and all of that goes towards project success. Back to the training example I was using.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't that long ago that I was about to help one of my customers with their user acceptance test experience. And I thought, well, I'll just get ahead of this a little bit and I'll go back over the old demos. I went over the old demos that came out of every sprint. I looked at them. It all made sense. It was perfect. It was beautiful. We wrote our test scripts. I sat down with the client. We opened up the very first screen and we went, what do we do now? Where do we start? So, just even something like that, we were able to communicate to the training team that there is a disconnect between the way they set up their training and the way that people had to actually put hands to keyboards. And so we have to be always alert, always watching out for those opportunities to improve what it is that we're doing and to continue to integrate all of the pieces of our project so that what we end up with is a cohesive success.
This is one of the common success mistakes that I see a lot of project managers making. They say, I think.
Yeah.
I think it should be this way. I think I should have a dashboard this way. I think. How much time does it take to ask? I'm not saying asking for permission. I'm saying ask for input. Yeah. How much time does it take to see that the world is a little bit bigger than the inside of my little head here? And that's where I see a lot of project managers. It's not because they have big egos. It's they see the role that they have is very important to the project, and it is. But the problem is the way that role is applied is critical.
Well, and the whole idea of, I think, you're no longer testing assumptions. You should always be testing your assumptions. You should always be testing your prerequisites and your biases and everything else, because every project is different, every team is different, every problem to be solved is different.
Right. And the greatest thing to overcome is your ego. And I'm not saying, emotional ego. I'm talking about intellectual and psychological ego. It's that little voice that says, logically, I've been doing this for 25 years. I should have this down pat. But the work we do as managers and leaders is such work that you need to, in order to do a really good job, is walk in as if this was your very first project and see it with those fresh green eyes every time.
You've got green eyes? Wow.
Yeah.
You said, what was it? You said that I think. The other one is, I'll try. Don't ever tell me you'll try. You will do. And if you have to try 6 times before you succeed, you're going to do that, but you're not going to tell me I'll try.
Yeah, do or do not. Wasn't that Yoda's response? Yeah, there is no try.
There is no try.
What there is there, thinking about the past, thinking about your confidence, thinking about your experience, and say, hey, I have about a 65 to 80% probability of being successful. Is that acceptable to you? That's not trying. That's a probabilistic estimate that gives somebody information that they can actually say yes or no back.
Yeah. And I had a boss that used to tell me, if you are right 60% of the time, and I don't mean right as in you and I are arguing and therefore I'm right. If I am correct in my assumptions, if I'm correct in the way to proceed, whatever, if I am right 60% of the time, I'm already ahead of the average person. Way ahead of the average person.
And that was Peter Drucker too. Peter Drucker said that every decision any manager or leader makes in anything, government, education, business, projects, anything, a third of the time you're going to get it right, a third of the time you're going to get it wrong, and a third of the time you're not even asking the right question. And so we have to look at it with that intent and realize, and all of a sudden we start realizing we have this stuff called systems thinking and critical analysis. And why don't we put this to better use, even on our simple projects?
Yeah, and by doing that, quite naturally, you will push your ego aside. And again, not the emotional ego, but the ego that says, I've done this before, I've seen this a million times, I can do it again. No, by doing that critical thinking, systems thinking, and understanding the odds are probably against you, then just apply that and make it work for you.
Yes. So this is a really interesting part of project management. And I want to impress on the people listening to this, integration and what we're talking about with this whole tying things together in a unifying whole is actually a wonderful opportunity for us. Because if we were working in operations, we'd be thinking about the day-to-day work, keep the business running. And it's not until you hit the general manager and above where you get to exercise and practice and start refining your integration with a project. As a project manager, even a 6-week to 6-month project, you're going to have to integrate, and you're going to have to play the role of frontline manager and executive on your project. So it's one of the best training fields for learning how to think and act like an executive, not just a manager.
Well, and I think the other thing is when you're in operations and as a manager, a lot of times you're reacting to what's occurring because you want to keep the lights on, you want to keep the business going. So you're in reactive mode a lot, not to say that you're not planning ahead. But when you're managing a project and when you're talking about this integration of project plans and activities, you really are forward thinking. You're prospectively thinking. You're looking at all of this is where risk management comes in, is you're always looking ahead. What are the pitfalls that I could end up taking my project into, or what's that silent thing that's about to hit my project that I'm having to become keenly aware of and thwart off before it hits. So yeah, what you're saying is exactly right. You have to have that systems thinking, that look ahead, that understanding that anything can come at you.
So this is where we get really starting to be fascinated. And this is, I think this is the point that you and I have been talking about, the point in a project manager's career where you start thinking maybe it's not all about the schedule, not all about the budget. And maybe it has a lot to do with the people aspect.
Oh, my favorite topic.
So I'm going to ask you an off-the-cuff question, okay? What do you think relationship management and people management and stakeholder engagement and all those have to do with integration? I have an idea, but I want to hear from you.
Well, again, it's that project management antenna, having them always up and always kind of looking around to see what's going on. And as long as I have those established relationships, both with my direct reports, with numbers of individuals on my team, with my client side, I'm always getting feedback. I'm always asking questions. I'm always getting feedback. They're asking me questions. I'm giving feedback. That communication, that people relationship allows me to keep my finger on the pulse at all times of what's going on in my project. And it's not just schedule, like you were saying. It's all aspects of that project.
And secondly, see, there's something called the voice of the customer.
Yes.
It's not our requirements. I think this is brilliant because both you and I have different perspectives and they're totally different, but they fit together so well because the voice of the customer says it's not my deliverable. It's not the team's deliverable. It's somebody else's. And it's that somebody else we need to please.
Yeah.
It's the value of somebody else we need to actually deliver, not us. Like I said, I think is an intrusion. It's adding my opinion. Sometimes it's appropriate, but as a project manager, more often than not, it's not. And it's our job as a big picture, systemic, or a integrated concept is to understand that purpose, that need, that value, that objective. Why are we doing this? Is it to help the entire employee base be safe? Is it to keep the business running because we need to create a new product? These are the things that we need to understand as a project manager, because those are the objectives that you need to point all of the activities and experts and budget on. That's what drives the project.
That's true. That when I was talking about the communication aspects and keeping those open, the customer, the voice of the customer is part of that, is also part of that equation, because as you were saying so elaborately, is that you have to understand the voice of the customer. But I'm going to throw a little monkey wrench into some of our newer project managers.
Good.
And that is that the voice of the customer is not always right. The customer is not always right. And now I can see little kind of brains kind of firing off all over the country. But the idea is that you and your customer have come to an agreement. It's called scope, cost, and schedule. And if your customer suddenly says, I need these 5 extra things, they may need them, but they're not right.
See, and that's where we actually sharpen other tools in the project manager toolkit. And one of those is consensus.
Yes, perfect.
And yeah, exactly. That's where we can actually not just set expectations, but get people to commit behind an agreement they may not buy in on.
Yeah.
And that is a whole topic in itself.
It certainly is. Let's remind our audience of some of the pitfalls that some of the common mistakes perhaps that project managers can allow themselves to fall into.
I'll give you 3.
All right.
Number 1, I'm really proud in risk management or quality management or schedule management. Great. Are you so proud of that you enjoy doing that at the cost of anything else?
Right.
Number 2, I have an opinion of my client and their business. Good.
Yeah.
Does that opinion help you understand the business and make the project better? Or does it hold you back?
Yeah.
And does it limit your ability to help the business and the client? And number 3, I have good metrics. Great. Are they the right metrics? Are they the balanced metrics? Are you measuring not just progress, but are you measuring value and quality and all these other things we're talking about? Your turn.
So the first one is what I would have said also was the first one. I called it an uncompromising adherence to that which I love. Because I'm familiar with it. I love it. That's where I'm going to spend my time. And so what if my communication fails, right? And if, yeah, so you said that so well. The second one, I'll put it this way. The second one that you mentioned, I'll put it this way, is that you develop these wonderful deliverables. You have this project management plan that becomes textbook. It's taught all over the world as an example of the most wonderful project management plan you can put together. And the minute it's finished and signed off by your customer, you put it on the shelf and it becomes shelf help.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't ever look at it again. And then you start again doing seat of the pants project management. You can't do that. And I've seen that happen so often. People deliver because they have to. They need that payment deliverable. And then once that's out of the way, it's kind of like, whew, got that out of the way, next. So that's a couple. And I think the other part of that, and I think you mentioned quality as well at one point, but the third part is not paying attention to the quality. Your customer is not paying you just for deliverables. They're paying you for quality deliverables. They're paying you and you're asking for them for a reference for your next project. You need to have that quality deliverable in their hands that they can be proud of as well as you. So that's some of those things that I would look at it if I were a brand new project manager, not to fall into those pitfalls.
Yeah. And again, this is not a career path that people get 100% right in their first 1 or 2 years,
or even their 20th year.
Yeah, it's something. Yeah, it's something that we enter into as a fresher or a green project manager every time we start a new project. And with that attitude and mindset, we have a greater opportunity to have our eyes and our minds open to not just what might hurt the project, but also what might help it.
Oh, so much so, yes.
Yeah. So what do you think? Have we covered the ground here on integration? I think we're comfortable.
I think so. And I want to go back to my opening gambit, and that was the whole idea of return on investment. Do we, as project managers, go back and say, okay, I've now delivered. We've done the adjustments all along the timeline. We have delivered something we are proud of and the client has accepted and are proud of. Have we, in fact, met our goal of the client's need for their return on what they've invested in us? And I think that's a question that we should never leave a project without asking that.
Right. And more often than not, well, it has to be that way. It has to be. You're not just delivering a deliverable, you're delivering value. You're delivering a solution to a real problem. Let's call it what it is. These problems that we work on as we get into our second and third decade of work, these problems make or break our clients' careers. They make decisions about whether they're going to lay off hundreds of employees versus hiring. These are the things that we have to realize. This is a really good job to have, but at the same point, we have to carry, that gravitas into our jobs and understand that, this is not just a nice to have that we're talking about, this integration stuff. This is a necessary component in order for us to do this work in the right way.
In my younger years, I used to teach my team to do cost-based thinking. As long as the costs took care of themselves, then the schedule and all that stuff kind of complied with that cost. So then we would deliver on time and on budget. And I changed that after a while, after I realized that we could be very cost effective and still not deliver a quality product. And so I changed my thinking. Maybe this is something we can explore at some future time, to more of a value-based thinking. Is every deliverable I produce, is every feature, is every user story, is every epic, is every release, is it in fact valuable to my client such that they can say, I'm glad I got you on my team? And that's more effective in my mind than cost-based thinking. And it kind of brings this whole return on investment, this whole integration of project plans and project activities together so that we end up delivering that quality product that's of value to our client.
It is all about the relationship, isn't it?
It sure is.
Okay.
It absolutely is.
And with that note, where can we find you next week, Merv?
Well, on that note, I just feel like I should tweet that. I felt that was pretty good. But I don't spend a lot of time on Twitter. I do spend more time on LinkedIn. So yeah, look me up, Merv Jersak on LinkedIn, or People First Project Management on LinkedIn.
Very good. And I as well. You'll probably see a few articles and comments from me too. But yeah, if you're not connected to me, please, I accept connections and am willing to learn from you as well as interact with you.
Yeah, exactly. All right. As I've said before, I can hardly wait to hear what we have to talk about next week.
Yes. Thanks again, Merv. You have a great week.